It was 12 days to Christmas, and Dan's house was full of noise. The children were running up and down, excited about their trip to the village. This wasn't their first time though. Every year, they traveled back home for Christmas. It was the only time they got to see their family in the village. The children loved it because the village was full of fresh air, big trees, rivers and streams to swim in and cousins to play with. Dan's wife, Kachi, was busy packing clothes and preparing snacks for the journey. She always made sure everything was ready days ahead so that nothing would be forgotten. But there was one thing she always worried about. Her husband never prayed. Dan, please, let's pray for just 2 minutes, she pleaded as she folded clothes into a bag. Dan waved his hand dismissively, as if chasing away a fly. Kachi, stop disturbing me. God knows I am traveling. He doesn't need me to remind him to protect us, he said, laughing. Kachi's heart felt heavy. She looked at her husband and shook her head. Why won't you understand? She whispered to herself. The children were no better. The older ones had started copying their father. Whenever Kachi knelt down in the morning to pray, they would grumble and drag their feet. Mama, why do we have to pray every day? It's boring, they would complain. But Kachi never stopped praying. Even when they made faces at her, she continued asking God to protect her family. Deep in her heart, she wished that Dan would join her, even just once. The house was filled with laughter and excitement as the children talked about what they would do in the village. Dan smiled at their joy, but Kachi sat quietly, watching her family. She held her breath and prayed silently. Lord, keep us safe this Christmas. One evening, while returning from work, Dan went to a grocery store to fetch a few items for his family. And after his purchases, on his way out of the store, he met an old man who called and stopped him. The old man's shirt was old, and he had a long walking stick in his hand. Dan went close to the old man. Papa, can I be of help? He asked, standing and holding items he purchased. My son, the old man said, his voice tired. I came in here to see you. Can I talk to you? Dan nodded. Papa, go ahead. Then the old man cleared his throat. My son, he began softly. I hope you won't be angry with what I'm about to say. Dan glanced at him, curious. What is it, Papa? The old man took a deep breath. This Christmas, you should not travel to your village. If you must travel, you and your family must pray earnestly and fast before the journey. There is danger ahead. His words hung in the air like smoke. Dan let out a loud, hearty laugh that made the old man's face tighten. Papa, you want me to stop my family from going to the village? This is not the first time I've traveled for Christmas. Nothing wrong will happen, he said, shaking his head. The old man looked at him, his eyes dark and serious. I've said what I came to say. The rest is up to you, my son. Dan thanked the old man for his concern and advice and proceeded to his car. The old man stood still watching as Dan hopped into his car and drove away. As he drove away, he thought to himself, why do people like to scare others with these horrible stories and imaginations? He convinced himself that he was just being superstitious or trying to sound wise. After all, he had made this trip many times before, and nothing had ever happened. But as the car disappeared into the evening, the old man stood still, watching. His face was unreadable. His words had been spoken, but what lay ahead was no longer in his hands. It was 2 days to Christmas, and the house was buzzing with excitement. Bags were packed and stacked by the door, filled with clothes, gifts, and snacks for the long journey. The children danced around, talking about the village and all the fun they would have with their cousins. Kachi, as always, was the calm one. Before they left, she called everyone to the living room. "Let's pray before we go," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Dan frowned. "Kachi, what is it with you and prayers? We are not going to a battleground. It's just the village." "Let me go and warm the car," he said, waving her off. Kachi sighed and knelt to pray alone with the children. She whispered her usual plea to God, "Protect us, Lord, and guide my family." Outside, Dan got into the driver's seat, turned the ignition key, and waited. But instead of the usual hum of the engine, there was silence. He tried again. The engine made some rolling sound, but refused to start. "What is this now?" Dan muttered. He got out, opened the bonnet, and scrutinized the engine once again for possible discovery of the issue. He jiggled a few wires and tried again. Still, the car wouldn't start. Frustrated, he went back inside to tell Kachi, "The car won't start. I don't know what's wrong with it," he said, scratching his head. "Are you sure that God is not using this to discourage us from embarking on this journey?" Kachi said. "I made a mistake by informing you. Instead of calling on the mechanic, there are things you can do on your own and suggestions you can put across instead of calling God every minute," Dan stated in anger. He went to his mechanic and he was informed he is out of town. He called on another mechanic and he arrived, checked the car, changed a few things, and the car started. "Hooray!" the children exclaimed. The bags were packed into the car and the children were very excited and hopped into the car. But Kachi's heart was unsettled and heavy, and she prayed silently, "Lord, take control." However, what Dan and his family didn't know was that not everyone was happy with their yearly Christmas visits. Far away in the village, there were joyous celebrations and activities for different families as they welcomed their children and relatives back home. In Dan's compound, Papa Ugo was worried. He is the one entrusted with the caretaking of the family houses in the village and has benefited heavily from Dan. Papa Ugo had suddenly become angry with Dan and his family and harboring deadly animosity against them. Why is it that Dan and his family arrived like city owners, displaying his exotic and big car for all to see? His wife, Kachi, and their children always appear healthy and attractive. Meanwhile, his son Ugo and his siblings find it difficult paying their way to the village. When they manage to return home, hardship will be written on them and they will have to process and sell farm produce before they could return to the city. Papa Ugo was extremely angry. Why must every Christmas be about Dan? He posited. His heart boiled with envy, and he decided that this year would be different. He visited his closest friend, Agu. "My brother," he said, his voice very low with concern, "I cannot take it anymore. This year, that boy and his family will not come here to intimidate heroes and show off their wealth." Agu, a divisive and tricky human, nodded. "You are right, Papa Ugo. It's time you did something about it. If I were in your position, I would have long done something to them." Without wasting time, Papa Ugo and Agu went deep into the forest of the neighboring village where a witch doctor named Egu lived. The path was dark, with trees twisted as though they were dancing. When they reached Egu's shrine, the eerie ambience of his shrine made them tread slowly. Egu, an old, lanky, tall man with white hair and beards, welcomed them. "Why have you come?" His voice piercing and deafening. Papa Ugo knelt on the shrine floor. "I want you to help me. Dan, my nephew, should not arrive for Christmas this year alive. He has intimidated me and my children for several years with his wealth, and this should end this Christmas." Egu chuckled, a chuckle that bore sinister intentions. He instructed Papa Ugo to mention Dan's name 3 times while standing and facing his shrine, which he did without wasting time. "Does any other thing bother you other than this?" he asked, his face threatening. Papa Ugo affirmatively answered, "No, Egu," in turn assured him that it is done. "You will not see them alive anymore," he declared. "Dan and his family will be crushed in a road accident." Papa Ugo was highly elated. He presented a black goat to Egu. He pointed at the goat and it vanished. This further frightened Papa Ugo and Agu amidst their happiness. They quickly thanked him and quietly left the shrine. When Papa Ugo returned home that night, he was beaming with joy. He was almost rehearsing how he will mourn Dan and his family. Egu's words at the shrine and his actions assured him greatly that soon the Christmas merriment will be cut short by the tragic demise of Dan and his family, and the villagers will mourn them. There would be no flashy car and expensive appearance to intimidate him. Dan and his family were already headed towards the highway and village bound. The children comfortably seated at the back seat of the car with Kachi, watching the fast movement of trees and bushes on the highway fading behind them, and cars from opposite lane dashing past their car with speed. The children sang and played in the vehicle, and sometimes ate food and snacks. In all this period, Kachi was praying for safety of their trip. The trip was smooth, and when they were halfway into their journey, a truck from the other lane lost control and started heading towards their direction, becoming increasingly big for a possible head-on collision. Dan saw it hit the long bus ahead of him, and galloping towards him, he tried to control the vehicle but eventually swerved toward the forest, and the truck followed suit towards the forest. Kachi held her children close. Kachi's voice rose above the chaos, crying out, "Lord, save us!" Then a loud bang. The front part of the truck climbed their bonnet and slightly smashed the side of their vehicle. Their bonnet was completely destroyed. Pandemonium ensued as people from other vehicles alighted and came for help. Far away in the village, the wind carried the news of the accident, whispering it into waiting ears. But what no one knew yet was who had survived. The news traveled fast. By sunset, it had already reached Dan's village. People gathered in small groups, murmuring and shaking their heads. "Did you hear? Dan and his family were in a terrible accident," someone said. Papa Ugo heard the news also. Villagers came to console him as he fell to the ground, wailing and shouting loudly, his clothes dirty with mud as he pretended to be in sorrow. "Oh, my nephew, my children! The enemies have succeeded in destroying me, the only shining light in our family," he cried, his voice rising for all to hear. But his heart was in merriment, relishing all the moments and his drama. Egu is great. It has happened the way he said it would, he thought. Dan's intimidation was over, he mused. At the accident scene, help finally arrived. Rescuers searched through the wreckage, expecting the worst, but when they found Kachi and her children, they were surprised. They were heavily in shock but not injured. Not a single bruise or scratch marked their skin for this level of accident. They appeared as though they were never at the car or at the accident scene. Dan, however, was unconscious. He was driving, and the force of the collision had impacted him. He was alive, but was unconscious. The rescuers rushed him to the hospital, accompanied by his family, their hearts heavy but grateful he was still alive. At the hospital, Kachi knelt beside her husband's bed. Their children huddled around her as she prayed, tears streaming down her face. "Lord, you saved us from the accident. Please preserve my husband. Let him be alive and well." The shock Dan suffered and the accident's impact caused him paralysis, and the doctors administered various drugs and ran several tests. A week after, he opened his eyes for the first time and spoke inaudibly. Kachi's heart swelled with gratitude and joy. Dan saw his children and his wife, and tears rolled down from his eyes, tears of joy and remorse. If he had prayed adequately with Kachi as she requested, this accident probably wouldn't have happened. He looked at Kachi, who stood silently, her hands clasped together. Dan broke down, his tears flowing freely. "I was foolish," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't listen. I didn't pray. I disregarded prayers and prayer invitations from my wife, and look at where I am now. I cannot stand. I cannot move." At the village, the news of Dan's survival beclouded the news of his death, as people celebrated and quickly spread the good news. Those who consoled Papa Ugo were the first to deliver the news to him. He pretended to be very happy, but within him is a man that is bitter and terribly angry. The next day, in a quiet afternoon, Agu was alone thinking aloud and imagining how possible it was that Dan escaped from this accident alive when Egu had assured them that it would be his end. He was puzzled, and as he was talking, little did he know that his neighbor, who was close to his house for a visit, overheard what he was saying and heard all that he did with Papa Ugo. His neighbor went back home and narrated to his son, who came home for the Christmas celebration, what he heard, and instructed him that when he returned to the city, he should warn Dan to be careful with Papa Ugo. After some weeks, he was discharged and was aided by his wife to move. At his city house, Dan continued to rely on his wife to move around and to do things. Few days after, a young man from his village visited them. He was the son of the man who had overheard Agu. He quickly narrated all that his father informed him about and delivered his father's warning. The whole room was quiet and the man subsequently left. Dan discontinued all the assistance he was rendering to Papa Ugo and decided never to travel to the village anymore. He became devoted to prayer, made sure that all that he did, he prayed for divine protection. His family became happier than before, as the children and Dan had realized in unsettling way the importance of prayer. Few years later, news came that Papa Ugo was terribly sick and later passed on. He had lost all that he benefited from Dan. Dan realized how important prayer is and how his wife's prayers had protected him and saved his life and that of his family. He understood also that regardless of the good you do to evil people, they will consistently seek to hurt you. This story is from Motherland Tales. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment to our channel so that whenever we post a new video, you will be the first to be notified. Please share with us what you have learned via the comment section. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.